In the winter of 1939, Finland was a quiet country of forests, lakes, and small towns scattered across the far north of Europe. Snow covered the landscape for months, and life often moved slowly through the long, dark winter days. Yet beyond the silence of those forests, tensions with the neighboring Soviet Union had been growing steadily. Negotiations had failed, distrust was rising, and both sides were preparing for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. When the fighting finally began, the frozen wilderness of Finland would become the setting for one of the most unusual wars of the 20th century. In the final months of 1939, as Europe was already beginning to feel the shock of the Second World War, another conflict quietly emerged far to the north. It began in the forests, lakes, and frozen landscapes of Finland, a country that had gained its independence only a little more than 2 decades earlier. The war that followed would come to be known as the Winter War, a short but intense struggle between Finland and the Soviet Union fought under some of the harshest winter conditions in modern military history. At the time, Finland was a small nation with a population of only a few million people. It had become independent in 1917 after the Russian Empire collapsed during the Russian Revolution. Before that moment, Finland had been ruled by Russia for more than a century. Independence brought both freedom and uncertainty as the new country worked to build its government, economy, and national defense. To the east lay the Soviet Union, a vast and powerful state led by Joseph Stalin. The Soviet leadership was deeply concerned about security along its western borders, particularly as tensions across Europe continued to rise during the late 1930s. One city in particular worried Soviet planners: Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg. This large and important Soviet city stood only a short distance from the Finnish border. From the Soviet perspective, the closeness of the border created a potential vulnerability. If a hostile power ever gained influence in Finland, the city of Leningrad might be exposed to attack. Because of this concern, Soviet leaders began seeking changes to the border between the two countries. In 1938 and 1939, negotiations were held between Soviet and Finnish representatives. The Soviet Union asked Finland to move the border farther away from Leningrad and to allow Soviet military bases in certain strategic areas along the Baltic Sea. In exchange, the Soviets offered Finland other pieces of territory farther north. For Finnish leaders, however, these demands raised serious concerns. The country had only recently achieved independence, and many officials feared that accepting such terms might weaken Finland's ability to defend itself or encourage further pressure in the future. As a result, the negotiations moved slowly and ultimately failed to produce an agreement. Meanwhile, the broader situation in Europe was rapidly becoming more dangerous. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, starting the Second World War. Shortly afterward, the Soviet Union also entered eastern Poland under a secret agreement with Germany that divided parts of Eastern Europe between the two powers. With Europe already at war, attention in Moscow increasingly turned toward Finland. Soviet leaders believed that securing the border near Leningrad was becoming more urgent as the international situation grew more unstable. At the end of November 1939, tensions suddenly escalated. An incident occurred near the border in which artillery shells exploded in a Soviet village called Mainila. The Soviet government quickly accused Finland of carrying out the attack. Finnish officials strongly denied responsibility and suggested that the incident might have been staged or misunderstood. Despite these denials, the Soviet Union announced that diplomatic relations with Finland had broken down. Only a few days later, on November 30th, 1939, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border in several locations. Thousands of troops, supported by tanks and aircraft, began advancing into Finnish territory. The Soviet leadership expected the campaign to be short. Their army was far larger and better equipped than Finland's, and many Soviet planners believed that resistance would collapse quickly. Yet the geography and climate of Finland would soon play a major role in shaping the war. Much of the country consisted of dense forests, frozen lakes, and narrow roads that wound through remote wilderness. As winter deepened, Temperatures dropped far below freezing, creating conditions that were extremely difficult for large armies to operate in. For the Finnish soldiers and civilians who now faced invasion, the coming months would become a struggle not only against a powerful military force, but also against the severe cold of the northern winter. The conflict that had just begun would soon prove far more difficult and costly than many had expected. When Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border on November 30th, 1939, the scale of the invasion was immediately clear. Along several parts of the frontier, large Soviet formations moved forward with tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The Soviet Union possessed enormous military resources compared with Finland. Its army numbered in the millions, and it had thousands of tanks and aircraft. Finland, by contrast, had a much smaller population and a limited military force. Many Soviet commanders believed the campaign would be quick. They expected Finnish defenses to collapse rapidly once the Red Army advanced across the border. Some Soviet leaders even imagined that the Finnish government might fall within weeks. But the reality of the battlefield soon proved very different. Finland's geography played an important role in shaping the conflict from the very beginning. Much of the country was covered by thick forests, frozen lakes, and long stretches of wilderness broken only by narrow roads. These landscapes made it difficult for large mechanized armies to move quickly. Tanks and supply vehicles were often forced to travel along a small number of roads, creating long columns that stretched through the snowy forests. Finnish commanders understood these conditions well. Many soldiers were familiar with the terrain and were used to traveling across forests and frozen ground using skis. Instead of confronting the much larger Soviet army in large open battles, Finnish forces often relied on smaller, mobile units that could move quickly through the landscape. As winter settled across the region, the weather added another powerful element to the war. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, sometimes reaching levels that made ordinary movement extremely difficult. Snow covered the forests and fields, while icy winds swept across the open areas. For soldiers on both sides, daily life in these conditions required constant effort simply to stay warm and functional. Finnish troops were generally better prepared for these harsh conditions. Many had winter clothing suited to the climate, and their tactics were designed for movement across snowy terrain. Soviet forces, on the other hand, sometimes struggled with equipment and logistical challenges as the cold intensified. One of the most important strategies used by Finnish forces involved isolating and attacking smaller parts of the advancing Soviet columns. When large Soviet units moved along narrow roads through the forests, Finnish troops would sometimes strike at the edges of these formations, cutting supply lines and separating groups of soldiers from one another. These tactics became known as Madi tactics, a term taken from a Finnish word that originally referred to stacks of cut firewood. The idea was similar to dividing a large pile of wood into smaller sections that could be handled more easily. By isolating portions of the Soviet forces, Finnish soldiers could concentrate their efforts on smaller groups rather than confronting the entire army at once. These engagements often took place deep within the snowy forests. Small Finnish units moved quietly through the trees on skis, using their knowledge of the terrain to approach Soviet positions unexpectedly. After striking quickly, they could disappear back into the forest before larger reinforcements arrived. One of the most famous areas of fighting during the early phase of the war occurred along the road leading to the town of Suomussalmi in northern Finland. Soviet forces attempted to advance along this route with large columns of troops and vehicles. However, the narrow road passing through dense forest created an ideal opportunity for Finnish forces to apply their tactics. Over time, Finnish units managed to surround and isolate sections of the advancing Soviet columns. The fighting in this region became extremely difficult, with soldiers battling not only each other, but also the severe cold and limited supplies. Meanwhile, in the southern parts of the country, Soviet forces focused their attention on the Karelian Isthmus, the region located between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. This area was strategically important because it provided the most direct route toward the Finnish capital, Helsinki. Here, the Finnish army had constructed defensive fortifications known collectively as the Mannerheim Line, named after Finnish military leader Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim. This defensive system included bunkers, trenches, and obstacles designed to slow the advance of attacking forces. The Soviet army launched several attempts to break through these defenses. Heavy artillery and infantry assaults were used in an effort to weaken the Finnish positions. The fighting along this front became some of the most intense of the war, with repeated attacks and counterattacks taking place in the snowy landscape. Despite facing overwhelming numbers, Finnish soldiers managed to hold many of their positions during the early weeks of the conflict. Their resistance surprised observers around the world. News reports described how a small nation was managing to resist a far larger military power under extremely difficult conditions. International attention soon turned toward the conflict. Many countries watched closely as the war unfolded, and public sympathy in several places favored Finland. Volunteers from different nations even traveled to assist the Finnish war effort, though the scale of this assistance remained limited. By the end of December 1939, the war had already lasted longer than many Soviet leaders had expected. Finnish resistance had slowed the advance in several areas, and the severe winter conditions continued to challenge both armies. Yet the Soviet Union still possessed enormous military resources. Even as early operations struggled, Soviet commanders began reorganizing their strategy and preparing new offensives designed to break through Finnish defenses. The war was therefore entering a new phase. The early weeks had shown that Finland could resist far more strongly than expected, but the conflict was far from over. In the months ahead, the Red Army would bring greater numbers of troops and heavier equipment to the battlefield in an effort to overcome the determined Finnish defense. The struggle across the frozen forests and fortified lines of Finland was only beginning. As the winter of 1939 deepened, the conflict between Finland and the Soviet Union entered a new and more demanding stage. The early weeks of the war had surprised many observers. Finnish resistance had slowed the Soviet advance in several areas, and the Red Army had encountered far greater difficulties than its leaders had originally expected. Yet the Soviet Union still possessed vast resources, and its leadership was determined to bring the campaign to a successful conclusion. By January 1940, Soviet commanders began reorganizing their strategy. Earlier operations had relied on rapid advances across multiple areas of the border, but the results had often been disappointing. Large columns of troops had struggled to move through forests and narrow roads, and some units had become vulnerable to the smaller and more mobile Finnish forces. Recognizing these problems, Soviet leadership decided to concentrate their efforts more heavily on the southern front, particularly along the Karelian Isthmus. This region lay between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland and formed the most direct route toward the Finnish heartland. If Soviet forces could break through the defensive lines there, they might be able to force Finland into negotiations. The Karelian Isthmus had already been heavily fortified by the Finnish army before the war began. These defenses, known collectively as the Mannerheim Line, consisted of bunkers, trenches, obstacles, and carefully prepared defensive positions built into the natural terrain. Although the fortifications were not as large or elaborate as some defensive systems elsewhere in Europe, they were positioned in ways that made attacking them extremely difficult. Throughout January, the Soviet Union began assembling a much larger concentration of troops, artillery, and armored vehicles in this region. Fresh divisions were brought forward, and large quantities of heavy equipment were moved into position. Soviet commanders also studied the earlier battles carefully in an attempt to avoid the mistakes that had slowed their advance during the first weeks of the war. Meanwhile, Finnish forces continued their defensive preparations. Soldiers reinforced bunkers, strengthened trenches, and worked tirelessly to maintain their positions in the freezing winter conditions. Temperatures often fell far below zero, and the deep snow created additional challenges for both sides. Life on the front lines during this period required extraordinary endurance. Soldiers spent long hours in exposed positions while icy winds moved across the frozen landscape. Weapons and machinery sometimes malfunctioned in the extreme cold, and simply keeping equipment operational became an ongoing struggle. Despite these difficulties, Finnish morale remained strong. Many soldiers believed they were defending their homeland against overwhelming odds, and this sense of purpose helped sustain their determination during the long winter days. By early February 1940, Soviet forces were ready to begin a new series of large-scale attacks along the Karelian Isthmus. This time the offensive was supported by enormous amounts of artillery. Thousands of shells were fired toward Finnish positions in an effort to weaken the defensive lines before infantry and armored units advanced. The bombardments were far heavier than anything seen earlier in the war. Finnish bunkers and defensive structures were subjected to repeated explosions as Soviet artillery attempted to break open the fortifications of the Mannerheim Line. After the artillery attacks, waves of Soviet infantry and tanks moved forward across the snow-covered ground. These assaults were carefully coordinated and supported by greater numbers of troops than in previous attempts. The scale of the offensive made it increasingly difficult for Finnish defenders to hold every position. Fighting along the defensive line became extremely intense. In some places, the battles continued for days as soldiers on both sides struggled for control of bunkers, trenches, and narrow sections of terrain. The deep snow, frozen ground, and constant shelling created a battlefield that was both exhausting and dangerous. Gradually, the increasing weight of Soviet forces began to have an effect. Some sections of the Finnish defenses were damaged or destroyed by the relentless artillery fire. In other areas, Soviet troops succeeded in finding weaknesses in the line and pushing forward through the defensive positions. One of the most important developments occurred when Soviet units managed to create a breakthrough in part of the Mannerheim Line. Once this opening appeared, additional troops and equipment were sent through the gap, allowing the Red Army to expand its advance. For Finnish commanders, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The army had fought bravely for weeks, but the country's limited resources were beginning to show. Ammunition, equipment, and manpower were all under growing pressure as the Soviet offensive intensified. At the same time, the Finnish government began considering the long-term situation. While resistance had been stronger than many had predicted, it was clear that the Soviet Union could continue bringing new troops and equipment to the battlefield. International reactions to the war continued to develop during this period. Many countries expressed sympathy for Finland, and volunteers from several nations traveled north to assist in the defense. There were also discussions in some European capitals about the possibility of sending military aid, though these plans faced many practical and political obstacles. As February continued, the Soviet advance along the Karelian Isthmus slowly gained momentum. Finnish units fought determinedly to slow the progress, but the pressure of repeated attacks and heavy artillery fire made it difficult to maintain every defensive position. The front lines gradually shifted as Soviet troops pushed deeper into the defensive network. Each new breakthrough created additional challenges for the Finnish army as commanders attempted to reorganize their remaining forces. The war was now approaching its most critical moment. After months of fighting in frozen forests and fortified lines, the balance of the conflict was beginning to change. The coming weeks would determine whether Finland could continue resisting or whether the war would soon move toward negotiations and an uncertain peace. By the end of February 1940, the Winter War had entered its most decisive stage. For several months, Finland had resisted the Soviet invasion with remarkable determination, using knowledge of the terrain, flexible tactics, and strong defensive positions to slow the advance of a much larger army. Yet the pressure on the Finnish defenses was steadily increasing. The Soviet Union had reorganized its military strategy and concentrated large numbers of troops and artillery along the Karelian Isthmus. With greater coordination and overwhelming firepower, the Red Army continued pressing against the Mannerheim Line, the system of fortifications that had served as Finland's primary defensive barrier in the south. Day after day, heavy artillery bombardments struck the Finnish positions. Bunkers that had survived earlier attacks were damaged or destroyed and the ground between the defensive lines became scarred with craters and shattered trees. After these bombardments, waves of Soviet infantry and armored vehicles advanced across the snow-covered landscape, attempting to widen the openings that had already begun to appear in the defensive system. Finnish soldiers continued resisting with determination, but the strain of the long winter campaign was becoming increasingly visible. Many units had been fighting continuously in extreme cold for weeks. Supplies were limited, and reinforcements were difficult to provide because Finland's population was small compared to that of the Soviet Union. Gradually, the Red Army began pushing deeper through parts of the defensive line. Once the Soviet forces succeeded in breaking through certain positions, they were able to move additional troops and equipment forward to expand those breakthroughs. Each new advance forced the Finnish defenders to withdraw to secondary lines or reorganize their remaining forces. Meanwhile, the situation facing the Finnish government became more serious. Although the country had gained international sympathy for its resistance, direct military assistance from other nations remained limited. Diplomatic discussions had taken place in several European capitals about possible aid, but the broader situation of the Second World War made large-scale intervention extremely difficult. Leaders in Helsinki, therefore, faced a difficult decision. Continuing the war might bring further destruction and loss, yet accepting peace would likely require painful territorial concessions. As Soviet forces advanced closer to important areas of southern Finland, the pressure to reach a settlement increased. During early March 1940, negotiations began to move forward between representatives of Finland and the Soviet Union. These discussions were difficult and complicated, as both sides attempted to secure terms that would protect their interests. While the negotiations continued, the fighting on the front lines did not completely stop. Soviet forces maintained their pressure along the Karelian Isthmus, and Finnish units continued defending their positions while awaiting news of a possible agreement. Finally, on March 12, 1940, the two sides signed a peace agreement known as the Moscow Peace Treaty. The treaty officially ended the Winter War, bringing an end to more than 3 months of intense fighting in the frozen landscapes of Northern Europe. The terms of the agreement required Finland to make significant territorial concessions to the Soviet Union. Large areas of the Karelian Isthmus were transferred, including the city of Viipuri, which had been one of Finland's most important urban centers. Finland also ceded territories around Lake Ladoga and several other strategic regions. These territorial losses forced hundreds of thousands of Finnish civilians to leave their homes and move to other parts of the country. Entire communities relocated as people abandoned towns and villages that were now part of the Soviet Union. Despite these losses, Finland remained an independent nation. Many observers around the world noted that although the Soviet Union had achieved its strategic objectives, the Finnish army had managed to resist far longer and more effectively than many had expected at the beginning of the war. The Winter War, therefore, left a strong impression on international opinion. It demonstrated how a smaller country could defend itself with determination, skillful tactics, and knowledge of the local terrain, even when facing a much larger opponent. For the Soviet Union, the war also revealed weaknesses within its military organization. Early operations had suffered from poor coordination and difficulties adapting to the harsh winter conditions. These lessons would later influence Soviet military reforms during the wider conflict of the Second World War. Although the fighting ended in March 1940, the relationship between Finland and the Soviet Union remained complicated in the years that followed. Only a little more than a year later, the two countries would again find themselves involved in another conflict known as the Continuation War, which took place during the larger struggle of the Second World War. Looking back, the Winter War remains one of the most striking examples of warfare conducted in extreme winter conditions. Soldiers fought across frozen lakes, dense forests, and snow-covered fields while temperatures dropped to levels rarely experienced in other European conflicts. The war also became part of Finland's national memory. Stories of the soldiers who defended the country during those difficult months continued to be remembered for generations. The conflict highlighted the challenges faced by nations caught between larger powers during times of global tension. Though it lasted only a few months, the Winter War demonstrated how geography, climate, strategy, and determination could shape the course of a military conflict. It remains an important chapter in the history of Northern Europe and in the broader story of the Second World War.